What is Latin America? That is the topic of this video lecture. Latin America consists of 20 countries that you see listed here on the slide, and I put a map of the region there to the right. You know Brazil is the largest country, and I've listed these countries, by the way, in order of population. Brazil has 204 million people, followed by Mexico, which has 125 million people. Then there's a significant drop-off to the third most populous country, Colombia, which possesses 46 million people. And for a long time, Argentina, which today is the fourth largest country, for a long time, Argentina was the third most populous until it was recently eclipsed by Colombia. Then we have Peru, which is the fifth most populous country with 32 million inhabitants. Then we have the middle-sized countries, and they range in between 10 and 30 million inhabitants, and they include Venezuela, Chile, Ecuador, Guatemala, Cuba, Haiti, and Bolivia. Followed by those, we have the smallest countries in the region, and these countries are less than 10 million inhabitants, and they include Honduras, Paraguay, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Panama, and Uruguay. Note on the map, above Brazil, to the east of Venezuela, along the Atlantic coast, there are three small countries, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana. Those three countries, and also numerous islands in the Caribbean Sea, they are not considered part of Latin America. And that has to do with because either they're not independent countries, they're still part of a European power, or they do not speak a Latin-derived language there. So Puerto Rico, for example. Puerto Rico, they speak Spanish, which is derived from Latin. However, Puerto Rico was part of Latin America until the 1898 Spanish-American War, when it was taken over by the United States. So we're not going to consider Puerto Rico as part of Latin America for the sake of this course. We're going to stick with these 20 countries that you see listed here. Latin America is a cultural region where the three Latin-descended languages of Spanish, Portuguese, and French are spoken. It was actually in France in the mid-19th century when the term Latin America became popularized. It was a time when France, under Napoleon III, was trying to reestablish French power in the Americas by promoting a common cultural heritage united by a language, family, and the Catholic religion. But remember, a central characteristic of the region is its cultural and demographic diversity. Of course, not everyone in Latin America, not everyone's first language is one derived from Latin. In fact, hundreds of Native American languages are spoken throughout the region. For instance, one of the major families, Nahuatl, is spoken throughout central Mexico. Likewise, in Guatemala and Mexico, there are millions of Mayan speakers. Quechua speakers, millions of them, live in Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. And also in Bolivia is where Aymara is spoken. Finally, in Paraguay, Guarani is spoken by 90% of the country's population. And these are just a few of the major language families. Another central characteristic of the region is that it is a mixture of mainly three world regions. Of course, the native inhabitants of the Americas, then Europe, and also Africa. Those are the three big regions that come together in Latin America. Native Americans, as you all know, have inhabited the Americas for thousands of years, and today about 45 million inhabitants in Latin America are considered indigenous. Countries with a high percentage of indigenous residents include Guatemala, Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador. Mexico is another country with millions of indigenous inhabitants, especially in the southern part of the country close to Guatemala. African-descended people make up a large percentage of population in countries where slavery dominated the economy in the colonial period and the 19th century. These countries include Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, and pockets of many countries where slave plantation labor dominated, especially along the coastlines, such as Venezuela and Colombia. Millions of Europeans, of course, colonized and settled in the region after Columbus's arrival in 1492. Today, countries with large white populations, such as Argentina and Uruguay, they experienced large-scale immigration in the early 20th century. And finally, to a lesser extent, Asians and Middle Easterners have also migrated to live in Latin America, and they're particularly focused in pockets. And specifically, Asians are focused in Lima, Peru, and also the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Those two cities have significant Asian-descended populations. Now let's have a look at several subregions of Latin America. First is this map of Central America, which, like Mexico, is part of the North American continent. In the northern part of the isthmus, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are known as the Northern Triangle because these three countries share a triangular border, and you can see it there on the map. That region is also significant because it's in the news a lot nowadays, because that is where the Central American migrant crisis is centered. Then below the Northern Triangle is Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. All those countries make up Central America. And Panama is interesting because it used to be part of Colombia until the early 1900s, when the United States sponsored a local revolt in the isthmus in order to install a government that would be friendly to the building of the Panama Canal. Another region within Latin America is the Caribbean Sea, which consists of many island nations. During the colonial period, the Caribbean was a region of competition between the imperial powers. The Caribbean Sea was a very geopolitically strategic region because it gives you access to the North American continent through the Gulf of Mexico. You have access also to Central America and to the northern coast of South America. And in the Caribbean during the colonial period, slavery and sugar plantations dominated the region's economy and society. And Cuba, as you can see from the map, is the largest island in the region. And it's followed by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which share the island of Hispaniola. Notice, too, that the northern coast of Venezuela, Colombia, and Central America also share a cultural heritage with Caribbean nations. So we could say those, Central America, Venezuela, and Colombia, could also be considered Caribbean nations because they're part of the Caribbean basin. Note that Jamaica is generally not considered part of Latin America because it was colonized by the British and English is spoken there today. And a lot of the smaller countries there in the Lesser Antilles of the Caribbean, those were colonized by the British, and so they're not going to be considered part of Latin America either. Then, of course, there is the continent of South America. The western part of the continent, as you can see from this map, is dominated by the mighty Andean mountains, which include glacial ranges in Chile, Peru, and Bolivia. The Andes also reach into Ecuador, Colombia, and a bit of Venezuela, although Venezuela is generally not considered an Andean country. The Andes Mountains was home to the Inca Empire when the Spaniards arrived in the 1520s, and today it remains home to millions of Quechua speakers. We also have the Amazon, which is home to the world's largest rainforest. All that water that descends off the Andes Mountains, it flows into tributaries and rivers that eventually flow into the mighty Amazon River, the world's largest. Most of the Amazon is located in Brazil, but Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia also possess Amazonian regions. Finally, in the southern part of the continent is what we call the Southern Cone because of the way it's shaped. And the Southern Cone consists of Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. And here is where Patagonia and the Great Plains of the Pampas are located. Okay, so that includes this week's lectures. Now you should read the introductions of the 3 readers and post your 2 discussion threads by Tuesday at 5 p.m. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm easy to reach online through email.